Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we sift through the most critical, strategic, and doctrinal material to give you the essential knowledge for modern leadership.
And today, well, we're undertaking a deep exploration that moves far past just, simple management skills or technical competence.
Yeah, we're diving into the ethical core of organizational leadership. We're focusing specifically on how leaders navigate those really high-stakes, ethically complex decisions, the kind that define their organizations and sometimes their careers.
Exactly. We're talking about moral ambiguity, often at the highest levels of command. And to help us unpack this, we've gathered three, I think, really powerful sources.
Right. First up, we've got foundational doctrine from the U.S. Army. That's Army Doctrine Publication 622, Army Leadership and the Profession. We're using the 2019 edition, but also incorporating Change 2, which came out in 2025.
Then we're applying a critical philosophical lens. We'll be using the ethical triangle, which is a conceptual tool developed by Svara. It really forces us to integrate different types of moral reasoning. It's not just about one approach.
And finally, we put this whole theoretical framework to the test, a really devastating real-world test, actually, with a historical case study from Philip Lasterl. It's titled, Could Admiral Gensoul Have Averted the Tragedy of Mers el-Kebir?
A tough one. So our mission today really is to provide you, the organizational leader, with a complete toolkit. We want to unpack those three essential legs of ethical reasoning: character, principles, and consequences.
And show how they absolutely must converge for decisions that truly stand the test of time, and moral scrutiny.
Because you're constantly faced with these decisions, right? You're balancing who you are, what the rules say, and crucially, what the ultimate outcome will be. It's a constant juggling act.
Okay, so let's start with that conceptual tool you mentioned, the foundation for our analysis today, the ethical triangle.
Right. This model, championed by Svara, argues pretty strongly that relying just on your gut, on intuition alone, or for that matter, only on rules, well, it's just not enough for complex ethical dilemmas.
So not just one thing.
No. Effective decision-making, Svara says, requires integrating three major approaches: virtue, principle, and consequence. You need all three.
And why is this framework so indispensable? What's the trap leaders fall into?
Well, it's often the default mode, When you're under pressure, it's so easy to fall back on just fast, intuitive decision-making, your gut instinct.
Speed feels good in a crisis.
It does. Speed's a benefit, sure. But Svara shows us that relying only on intuition risks completely missing the moral complexities of a situation. You might overlook critical factors.
Which can lead to, what? Bad outcome.
Oh, catastrophic unintended consequences. Or, frankly, sometimes unethical behavior that gets disguised as just being decisive.
Okay. And what if you move away from intuition, but you just latch onto one single approach, like only rules?
That's also a problem, Svara points out. Your analysis will always be incomplete. If you stick rigidly to the rules, the principle-based approach, you might ignore a terrible outcome. You end up becoming like a bureaucrat of destruction, just following the letter of the law off a cliff.
Ouch.
Mm-hmm.
And the opposite, just chasing the greatest good.
If you only chase the greatest good, the consequence-based approach, you might trample all over core human rights or principles that, well, society has agreed must remain inviolable. You sacrifice the few for the many, sometimes unjustly.
So the key is synthesis, bringing them together.
Exactly. We have to seek a reasoned, balanced approach. This allows you to clearly articulate the full moral weight of your decision, especially when you have to explain tough choices to your subordinates, to your stakeholders. The ethical triangle is really designed to make you stop, take a breath, think, and filter your choices through all three essential lenses.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's anchor ourselves then. Where do we start? What's the absolute bedrock?
Army Doctrine Publication 622 calls it character. That's the starting point. This attribute category is the foundation upon which really all leader auctions rest.
Character. Okay, so what does Army Doctrine Publication 622 say about it?
Well, Chapter 2 gets right into it. It defines character as the moral and ethical qualities of an individual. And crucially, those qualities are revealed directly through their decisions and their actions. It's not just what you think, it's what you do.
So reputation is tied to this.
Very much so. The doctrine emphasizes that a leader's personal reputation is what others perceive as character, and a leader who consistently adheres to the laws, to professional standards, well, they build indispensable credibility with subordinates, and that enhances the essential trust they hold with the organization and ultimately the nation they serve.
That trust piece is huge. Now, you mentioned something earlier about changing character. The doctrine has a specific take on that, doesn't it?
It does, and I think it's a really compelling insight. Things like education, self-development, counseling, coaching, mentoring, they can certainly refine the outward signs of character, how we behave, what we say.
Right. Polishing the surface.
Kind of, but the doctrine states that modifying deeply held values is the only way to genuinely change character itself.
Wow. So it's not just a veneer you put on.
Exactly. It's the internal operating system. And leaders aren't just responsible for their own system. They have to actively encourage, support, and assess their subordinates' continuous efforts to embody strong character.
It's an ongoing process, not a one-time fix.
It's a never-ending internal process, requires constant introspection effort. And that effort has to be driven and modeled by the organization's senior leaders.
Okay. So Army Doctrine Publication 622 lays out key character attributes. What are they centered around?
They're centered around the Army values: loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. These are described as the principles, standards, qualities. Basically, the essentials for successful leaders in the profession.
And we need to see these dynamically, right? Not just a list to memorize.
Precisely. The doctrine puts a really profound emphasis on dignity and respect. It stresses treating all people with dignity and respect, regardless of their background, their creed, orientation, whatever.
And it connects that back.
It explicitly links this back to the founding ideal of the nation, that all are created equal. And this focus even extends to how leaders treat adversaries. It notes that fostering a positive climate begins right there, with the leader's personal example of professional conduct.
Okay, but here's where the rubber meets the road, right, for organizational leaders. What happens when these values conflict? Say, loyalty to maybe an incompetent supervisor clashes with your duty to get the mission done. Which one wins?
That's the friction, absolutely. These values aren't always perfectly aligned in practice, and that's exactly why the doctrine emphasizes the need for strong personal courage.
Personal courage. Let's break that down. ADP 622 distinguishes types, doesn't it?
It does. It breaks it down into two distinct yet related forms: physical and moral courage. Physical courage is, well, pretty much what it sounds like: overcoming fears of bodily harm to perform your duty.
Can you give us an example? The doctrine mentions one, I think.
Yeah, it references Lieutenant Vernon Baker near Viareggio, Italy, back in April 1945. His company's advance was totally stalled by entrenched German positions.
What did he do?
Lieutenant Baker, facing intense enemy fire, crawled forward by himself, destroyed multiple enemy positions, killed several German soldiers, and just kept fighting until his commander finally ordered a withdrawal. That raw intensity, that self-sacrifice, overcoming the primal fear of death to accomplish the mission, that's the kind of physical courage that inspires others to fight alongside you.
Okay. Intense. But what about the other type? Moral courage. You said that's maybe more relevant for organizational leaders day to day.
I'd argue yes, often more challenging in the organizational context. Moral courage is the strength you need to stand firm on your values, your principles, your convictions, even when you're facing tremendous internal pressure from the organization or potential professional repercussions or even resistance from your own superiors.
And the doctrine gives a classic example here too, right?
The quintessential example: Warrant Officer 1 Hugh C. Thompson, Jr. during the My Lai incident in Vietnam. His actions are used as a textbook case of moral courage.
Remind us what happened.
Thompson was flying a reconnaissance mission and witnessed American soldiers firing on unarmed Vietnamese civilians. He landed his helicopter, deliberately placed it between the advancing American troops and the remaining villagers.
Wow.
Then he ordered his gunner to train their weapon on the American troops and to fire if they continued the aggression against the civilians.
Think about the weight of that moment.
Yeah.
Putting yourself between your own side and civilians.
Exactly. He definitely placed himself in physical danger, yes. But the real act of moral courage was that immediate choice. He prioritized the ethical, the moral principle, the sanctity of civilian life over what might be expected, unit cohesion or obedience to fellow troops on the ground.
It's an incredible example. Does the doctrine mention others?
It also highlights Captain Humbert R. Versace. As a prisoner of war in Vietnam, he absolutely refused to violate the code of conduct. He resisted his captors despite extreme pressure, torture. His actions became a model for his fellow prisoners. It showed that sometimes the strength of your beliefs, your character, is the only weapon you have left.
So this deep focus in Army Doctrine Publication 622 on developing and demanding strong character. How does this connect back to the ethical triangle we started with?
It aligns perfectly. This foundational focus on character connects directly to the virtue intuition corner of Svara's ethical triangle.
The corner that asks,
What shall I be? Virtue ethics is all about those settled habits, those dispositions. It draws on core societal values like integrity, honesty, fairness.
And the advantage there is.
Its primary advantage, as Svara notes, is easy accessibility. Often, the ethical choice feels intuitive because it draws on character that you've hopefully consciously cultivated over time. You just know the right thing.
But there's a disadvantage, too.
There is. Good character alone doesn't always give you the functional roadmap for making the decision, especially in complex situations. You might be a good person, but you might still not know how to do the most good, or which principle takes priority when things get really messy.
Which is why we need the other two corners of the triangle.
Precisely. Virtue is essential, it's the bedrock, but it's not sufficient by itself.
Okay, so we've established character as the foundation, linking it to that virtue intuition corner. Now let's zoom out again to the broader decision-making structure Svara provides. You said leaders have to use all three approaches.
Yes, James Svara insists on it. Organizational leaders must use all three ethical approaches, virtue, principle, and consequence, as complementary filters. That's the core instruction of the ethical triangle.
Why is that integration so critical?
Svara's genius, I think, is in showing that integration is necessary to avoid the really severe shortcomings you get if you rely on just one model. The goal is to make sure your final choice satisfies three core demands: integrity, justice, and achieving the greatest good.
Okay, let's dig into those corners again, starting with that first one. Virtue intuition, which Svara links to integrity.
Right. So this focuses again on the qualities of the good person. It asks, what would a person of integrity do? And the source material explicitly states that virtues like honesty, integrity, caring for others, fairness, these aren't accidental. They have to be intentionally cultivated.
Practice makes permanent, kind of?
Pretty much. If you're honest in small things, you're much more likely to be honest when the stakes are high. It offers that unity, that consistency of character.
But Svara warns about a pitfall here, right? If you only focus on virtue.
Yes, and this is crucial. He shows that when a leader relies only on virtue, kind of moving out from the balanced center of the triangle towards a narrow, self-focused application, their behavior can become self-serving.
Self-serving, how does that manifest?
It's often driven by narcissistic tendencies, Ara suggests, or maybe a sense of entitlement. The leader becomes focused primarily on maintaining their self-image as a good person or a hero, rather than achieving actual, verifiable, good outcomes for the organization or its people.
So they might make a decision just because it makes them look good, even if it's not the best practical choice.
Exactly. They might refuse a necessary but maybe politically damaging compromise simply because it would stain their reputation for being tough or pure. The outcome isn't what matters most to them anymore. Their self-perception is. That's the danger.
Okay, moving to the second corner then. Principle-based ethics, also known as deontology. Svara links this to justice and fairness.
Right. Deontology, it comes from the Greek word for duty bases, ethical decision-making on applying universal, agreed-upon principles or rules.
So for an organizational leader, this means?
It means the moral worth of an action is determined entirely by the principle from which it's performed, not by the results it produces. It's about following the right rule.
Okay, let's translate that philosophical jargon. We're talking about things like the rule of law, right? Following procedures.
Essentially, yes. A rule deontologist, for example, might argue that lying is always morally wrong, regardless of the consequences, because the principle of truth-telling is seen as a universal moral obligation. They try to establish principles that apply consistently across different situations.
Where do these principles come from in our context? Military, public service?
Well, for public administration and military service, these principles are often rooted in what Svara calls regime values. Think about the Constitution's guarantees: due process, equal protection, freedom of speech. These principles identify kinds of action that are right or obligatory, and they provide essential structure and predictability for large organizations. You need rules to function at scale.
But, like the virtue corner, this approach has its own risks, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What's the pitfall here?
A big one. Svara identifies the danger as the rigid application of rules, following the letter rather than the spirit of the law. We sometimes call it following orders blindly.
I can see how that causes friction.
Absolutely. Think about it. You're trained to follow the rules, the procedures, but then a crisis hits, and it demands flexibility, maybe even breaking a rule for a better outcome. If you adhere dogmatically to procedure, you might sacrifice common sense or prevent a much better outcome just to stay within the lines.
And what if the principles themselves conflict?
That's another major problem. Say, the principle of confidentiality conflicts with the principle of warning potential victims about a threat. Rigid adherence to just one rule can lead to ethical compromise elsewhere, and maybe even compromise the mission itself. The leader can become paralyzed by legalism, unable to act effectively.
Okay, which brings us logically to the third corner, consequence-based ethics, also called utilitarianism, focused on achieving the greatest good.
Right. This approach, also called teleology from the Greek for end or purpose, holds that an action is right or wrong depending solely on its results, its consequences.
So the best choice is?
The preferred ethical choice is the one that produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people affected. It fundamentally rejects the idea that moral principles justify an action before you know the outcome. Everything is judged by the calculation of the final score, so to speak.
Now, on the surface, that sounds incredibly practical. Choose the option that helps the most people. Simple.
It sounds simple, but this is actually the area where some of the greatest strategic ethical missteps can happen, precisely because it requires quantifying value, often in situations where value is hard to measure.
What's the specific pitfall Svara points out?
The obvious one, the focus on expediency. It risks sacrificing core principles or individual rights just to get a perceived collective benefit. This is where we can see that danger of organizational leaders focusing too narrowly on short-term gains, or behavior that looks like following orders blindly because the order promises a good outcome, even if the order itself is questionable.
And the calculation itself. It can be arbitrary, can't it?
Hugely arbitrary. If you only care about the greatest number, you might logically justify sacrificing one person's life or their rights or their career to save 5 others, even if the act of sacrifice itself violates every principle of integrity you hold dear.
Who gets to decide the value of that individual?
Exactly. The utilitarian path is morally treacherous precisely because it forces us to place measurable values on things that maybe aren't quantifiable, like fundamental rights or human dignity.
So the big takeaway from Svara, then, is that the organizational leader's real job isn't to pick their favorite corner of the triangle.
No, not at all.
But to ensure that any high-stakes decision has been deliberately filtered through all 3 perspectives.
That's it, exactly. You have to ask. Are we acting with integrity here, virtue? Are we upholding our core principles and rules, principle? And are we genuinely achieving the best possible outcome for the most people affected, considering all costs? Consequence? You need yes to all 3, ideally, or at least a clear understanding of the trade-offs.
Okay, theory is one thing. Let's really test the power and maybe the agony of navigating this ethical triangle. Let's turn to our historical case study. The tragedy of Mers el-Kebir, as detailed in Philippe Lastol's analysis.
Yeah, this isn't just history. It's really a masterclass in high-stakes, real-world ethical failure under the immediate crushing stress of national defeat.
Set the scene for us. The context is vital here.
Absolutely critical. It's July 3rd, 1940. France has just signed an armistice with Nazi Germany. This act itself violated a solemn international agreement France had made with Britain that neither country would make a separate peace with Germany.
So the alliance was already broken, essentially.
Broken at the highest political level, yes. And the British, led by Winston Churchill, were now fighting alone. They were in an existential struggle for survival. Their massive fear was that the powerful French fleet, the forced raid, which was anchored at Mers el-Kebir near Oran in Algeria,
would fall into German or Italian hands.
Precisely. If the Axis powers got control of those modern French warships, it could instantly shift the naval balance of power, cutting off Britain's supply lines and potentially dooming the United Kingdom.
So the British felt they had to act.
They felt they had no choice. The Royal Navy's Force H, commanded by Admiral James Somerville, arrived off the Algerian coast. His orders were codenamed Operation Catapult. Neutralize the French fleet one way or another.
And the result was?
Tragic. The ensuing attack involved British warships firing on the French ships at anchor. Several French warships were destroyed or crippled, and devastatingly, more than 1,200 French sailors were killed. Admiral Marcel Gensoul, the commander of that French squadron, was forced to navigate an absolutely impossible choice in those hours.
What was the ultimatum Somerville gave Gensoul?
It was pretty uncompromising. Somerville presented Gensoul with 4 options to avoid conflict. 1, sail with the British and continue fighting the Axis. 2, sail to a British port where the ships would be controlled by the British. 3, sail to the French Antilles or maybe the United States under British control to be disarmed.
And the 4th option?
Crucially, if Gensoul refused all of those fair offers, as the British termed them, he was told he must scuttle his ships, sink them himself right there in the harbor.
And if he refused all of those options?
Then Somerville had strict, explicit orders from Churchill. Use whatever force necessary to ensure the French ships could not fall into enemy hands. Basically, sink the French squadron.
Okay, let's apply our ethical triangle to Admiral Gensoul's perspective. Start with the principle-based lens. What rules or duties was he grappling with?
Well, Gensoul was a highly disciplined professional sailor, and he faced a devastating conflict between two deeply held high-level principles. First, the principle of obedience to his own chain of command. Second, the principle of international alliance, though that was already fractured.
Explain that conflict. Obedience versus...
The conflict was agonizing because the armistice with Germany was, at that moment, the legal basis for his command structure. Gensoul couldn't easily disobey his superior, Admiral Darlan, who was the Minister of the Navy. Darlan had issued very strict orders about protecting the fleet and not letting it fall into anyone's hands, German or British, and certainly not surrendering it.
So accepting the British terms would break his orders from Darlan.
Absolutely. The source notes that accepting the British terms, like joining them or sailing to the Antilles under their control, would have immediately broken the Franco-German armistice. That could have plunged France into an even worse legal and military position with Germany. So his principle of obedience seemed to demand adherence to the armistice terms set by his government, no matter how humiliating they felt.
But what about the other principle, the alliance with Britain?
Well, as you pointed out, the armistice itself had already violated the previously signed principle of alliance with Britain, that no separate peace agreement. So Gensoul was trapped. He was caught between two competing legal and political obligations, and neither offered a clear path forward that would satisfy the other side.
That sounds exactly like the principle traps Svara warns about. When rules conflict, sticking rigidly to one just leads to destruction in the other domain.
Precisely. There was no purely principled right answer available to him in that moment.
Okay, now let's shift perspective. Apply the virtue-based lens. What about Gensoul's honor, his moral character? How did that play in?
Austerl's analysis highlights this strongly. Gensoul's initial rejection of the British ultimatum was based, in large part, on his determination not to negotiate under threat. That was a clear point of military honor and personal integrity for him.
Being forced to accept terms at gunpoint.
In his view, that would have violated the very concept of the honor of the French flag. He couldn't stomach it.
But wait, does this touch on that self-serving pitfall we talked about? Where protecting one's image of honor overrides a practical solution?
It's a really difficult question. While his stance was rooted in integrity and honor, that rigid determination not to negotiate under threat ultimately contributed to the tragic outcome, the deaths of his sailors. However, Gensoul did attempt a compromise, which speaks perhaps more positively to his personal integrity.
What was the compromise he offered?
He proposed disarming his squadron in place, right there in Oran Harbor. He offered it as a gentleman's agreement. And interestingly, this was actually a solution that had been suggested previously by Britain's own First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound.
So, a possible path existed, one based on trust and honor.
It seems so. This point is critical. The disarmament option represented a potential path of compromise, one rooted in mutual professional trust between officers. And Lastrell contrasts this tragedy at Mers el-Kabir with what happened just a few days later in Alexandria, Egypt.
What happened there?
In Alexandria, the French admiral, René Godfrey, did accept a similar disarmament solution with the British Admiral Cunningham. Lastrell argues that successful compromise was possible precisely because there were, and I quote Lastrell here, long-established personal and, above all, direct contacts between Godfrey and Cunningham. They knew each other, they trusted each other.
Allowing for trust-based compromise.
Exactly. But at Mers el-Kabir, that trust, that relational capital, was completely lacking between Gensoul and Somerville.
Somerville wouldn't meet him personally at first?
Right. Somerville, though apparently reluctant to actually open fire, refused to meet Gensoul personally until very late in the day, when things were already escalating. So Gensoul's virtue, his integrity, sought an honorable compromise. But the personal trust needed to make that compromise viable had already been destroyed weeks earlier at the strategic and political level. His virtue ran into a wall of mistrust.
Which forces us to look at the final lens, the crucial consequence-based lens. What was the utilitarian calculus here, especially from the British side, from Churchill?
We have to consider the brutal reality driving Churchill. Army Doctrine Publication 622 reminds us this approach looks strictly at results, and Churchill's decision to issue the ultimatum and ultimately authorize the attack was purely consequentialist. He was looking at the potential future outcome.
What were the consequences he was trying to achieve or avoid?
He imposed Operation Catapult to achieve two massive strategic consequences. First, and most importantly, to absolutely preclude the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, from seizing the French fleet. That was seen as an existential threat to the United Kingdom's survival. If that fleet joined the Axis, Britain likely falls. End of story.
And the second consequence.
He also needed to solidify his own authority as the war leader. He'd only recently become prime minister, leading a still fragile coalition government. He needed to prove to his own people and to the world, especially the Americans, that Britain was still in the fight and that he would take ruthless, decisive action to survive.
So his calculation was about certainty.
Absolute certainty. Think about the consequence of Gensoul's refusal, and then Churchill's subsequent rejection of Gensoul's compromise offered the offer to disarm in place. Churchill prioritized the certainty of neutralization, even if it had to be achieved through the horrific violence of sinking an Allied fleet.
Over the risk that a disarm-in-place agreement might be breached later, allowing the ships to fall into German hands anyway.
Exactly. Even though that disarmament option was apparently acceptable to many of his own admirals, like Pound, Churchill wasn't willing to take the risk. The potential negative consequence, losing the Battle of the Atlantic, was too great.
So this really demonstrates the ultimate moral burden of pure consequence-based ethics. Churchill aimed for the greatest good for the largest number, the survival of Britain, and arguably the free world.
But at the direct, immediate, and tragic cost of 1,200 French lives and the destruction of trust with a former ally. The perceived future consequences justified, in his mind, the violation of principles of alliance and the sacrifice of those individual lives in the present.
And what was Lastrell's final verdict on whether this could have been avoided?
This is maybe the most chilling point, and it applies directly to organizational leaders today. Lastrell concludes the tragedy could not really have been averted on July 3rd itself, when Gensoul was trapped making his tactical, immediate decision under fire. Because the crisis was essentially unavoidable by that point. It had been predetermined much earlier, Lastrell argues, back in that crucial period of June 16th to 25th, just before the Franco-German armistice was finalized.
What happened then?
That was the window when French political and military leaders failed. They failed to establish sufficient trust, failed to communicate effectively, failed to convince the British leadership under Churchill that the French fleet would definitely be kept out of German hands. That failure, that breakdown of strategic trust weeks earlier, is what set the stage for the violence.
Wow. So the consequences were effectively locked in by a failure of trust and strategic foresight at the highest levels, long before Admiral Gensoul was forced into that impossible corner, pitting his honor against his orders and the lives of his sailors.
That's Lastrell's argument. The tactical leader was facing an ethically unwinnable situation because of strategic failures that had already occurred.
That case study is sobering. It forces us to shift our perspective, doesn't it? Away from just the immediate crisis moment, back to the longer-term responsibilities of leadership, especially in large organizations. Back to the bureaucracy, maybe, where most organizational leaders spend their time.
Exactly. And Army Doctrine Publication 622 dedicates specific attention to this. It talks about organizational leadership leaders operating more through indirect influence, through policy, commanding hundreds or thousands of people.
And this brings us back to one of the core leader competencies mentioned in ADP 622, right? The competency of develops.
Yes, develops, which is detailed in Chapter 6. And organizational leaders are specifically called stewards of the profession. Steward, that's a really profound responsibility.
What does stewardship entail at this level?
It means caring for your people, absolutely. But also protecting resources and actively working to advance the profession itself, looking ahead, anticipating future changes. Organizational leaders must develop organizations that are ethically equipped to accomplish the mission long after that particular leader has moved on. It's about building lasting capability.
So a big part of this stewardship is taking these complex ethical ideas we've been discussing, like the ethical triangle, and translating them into something practical. Understandable policies, plans.
Precisely. It means setting the ethical climate for the entire organization through consistent attitudes, clear policies, effective development programs. The organizational leader is fundamentally responsible for ensuring the climate upholds the Army ethic.
Remind us what the Army ethic encompasses.
It's defined as the comprehensive set of enduring moral principles, values, beliefs, and laws that guide the profession's actions. The organizational leader sets the tone for how that ethic is lived day in and day out.
And part of that stewardship, part of upholding the ethic, must be actively preparing the next generation, right? Giving them the tools to analyze these tough ethical friction points, like the one Gensoul faced.
Absolutely critical. And Army Doctrine Publication 622 describes 3 primary roles organizational leaders play in developing subordinates into ethical actors: counseling, coaching, and mentoring. And importantly, these aren't just interchangeable buzzwords for having a chat. They are distinct practices.
Okay, let's elaborate on those.
Mm-hmm.
The doctrine gives precise definitions, which seem key for leaders trying to implement this effectively. Let's start with counseling.
Right. Counseling is described as a formal or informal conversation process. Leaders use it to guide subordinates, help them improve performance, identify strengths and weaknesses, overcome those weaknesses, and ultimately develop their full potential. The key outcome is usually clarity and an action plan, often an individual development plan. It's about structure, accountability, targeted improvement.
Okay. How does coaching differ then?
Coaching is much more focused on capability enhancement. It relies heavily on teaching and guiding to improve specific skills, tasks, or behaviors that the subordinate already possesses to some degree.
So it's about refinement.
Yes. The coach typically has considerable knowledge in that specific area. They demonstrate the skill, they observe the subordinate's performance, and they provide real-time, focused feedback and guidance. It's surgical, targeted towards improving competency in a specific domain.
All right. Counseling for planning and accountability. Coaching for specific skill enhancement. What about mentoring?
Mentoring is often the most voluntary of the 3, and arguably the most critical for deep character growth. It's defined as a mutual voluntary agreement. The mentor, usually someone with significantly greater experience, shares broader knowledge, insights, wisdom. They might provide challenges related to professional or personal growth, and they often address deeper questions on a more philosophical or personal level.
So mentoring is where those really thorny questions about loyalty, honor, ethical trade-offs, the stuff from the triangle might get constructively debated and explored.
Exactly. It's often less about specific tasks and more about navigating the profession, understanding the unwritten rules, and grappling with those fundamental character questions.
Beyond these direct development roles, what about the overall environment?
That's crucial too. Chapter 6 of Army Doctrine Publication 622 really stresses that organizational leaders must create a positive learning environment, an environment that actively encourages initiative, where people feel safe offering constructive feedback, even dissent, without fear of reprisal or punishment.
That psychological safety piece.
Immensely important. And critically, the doctrine suggests that leaders should not be afraid to underwrite honest mistakes. They need to allow others to learn from errors without destroying their careers. This is absolutely essential for ethical growth. Why? Because subordinates have to feel safe trying to apply these complex new ethical filters, like the triangle, without being terrified that an imperfect outcome will be fatal to their progression. Learning requires the room to sometimes get it wrong.
Okay, so that's the positive side, stewardship, development, creating a learning climate. What's the flip side? What's the ultimate failure in stewardship?
That would be counterproductive leadership. It's detailed extensively in Chapter 8 of the Doctrine, and Army Doctrine Publication 622 makes it brutally clear. These are behaviors that violate one or more of the core leader competencies or the Army values, and they actively prevent the creation of a climate conducive to mission accomplishment. They destroy readiness, morale, and talent over the long term.
What kinds of behaviors fall under this counterproductive banner? Do they link back to Svara's pitfalls?
They often do, yes. For example, the doctrine lists self-serving behaviors, things like displaying arrogance, routinely taking credit for others' work, acting with a sense of entitlement. Doesn't that sound exactly like the practical manifestation of Svara's narcissistic pitfall under the virtue ethics corner?
Yeah, it does. The leader focused only on their own standing.
Precisely. They're concerned with their image, not the mission or the people. Then you have things like erratic behaviors.
Such as
Losing one's temper frequently, being unapproachable, displaying wild inconsistency. These behaviors completely destroy the psychological safety we just talked about. Subordinates won't feel comfortable offering alternative perspectives or voicing ethical concerns if they fear an unpredictable or angry outburst.
shuts down communication.
Completely. And finally, there's a devastating category the doctrine calls leadership incompetence. This is defined as ineffective behaviors resulting either from a genuine lack of experience or from willful neglect.
So not trying, or just not capable.
Could be either. Things like being consistently unengaged, displaying poor judgment, maybe failing to apply those principle and consequence filters Svara described can fall into this category. And the doctrine concludes, very starkly, that the prolonged use of any of these counterproductive behaviors destroys trust, cohesion, and commitment over the long term. It makes fostering that necessary learning climate and ultimately achieving the mission impossible.
So effective stewardship requires a two-pronged approach. Actively cultivate ethical reasoning in your people through counseling, coaching, mentoring, and creating that safe environment.
While simultaneously and ruthlessly identifying and eliminating any counterproductive behavior, including potentially your own, that reinforces those negative pitfalls Svara identified. A failure to lead ethically yourself today actively undermines your entire organization's ethical capacity for tomorrow. It has long-term consequences.
All right. As we bring this deep dive to a close, let's try to synthesize these powerful sources into a coherent picture for you, the organizational leader listening right now.
Yeah, the bottom line seems clear. Effective leadership, especially at the organizational level, demands far more than just being technically good at your job. It requires the sophisticated ability to simultaneously balance those three essential ethical claims: virtue, principle, and consequence.
So Army Doctrine Publication 622 gives us the character foundation, right?
Yeah.
The integrity, the moral courage you need just to face the dilemma. It tells you what you must be.
Exactly. And then Svara provides the framework, the ethical triangle, for structured analysis. It ensures you don't just rely on flawed gut instinct or narrow expediency. It tells you how you must think through the problem.
And the Mirza Kabir case,
Mhm.
well, that demonstrates the agonizing friction when these elements collide under extreme duress. It particularly highlights how a tactical crisis can be the symptom of a much larger systemic failure of trust and communication that happened way earlier. It really shows you the cost of failure at multiple levels.
It does, tragically so. And organizational leaders also have to be constantly preparing themselves and their people for that highest level of command, strategic leadership.
What does ADP 622 say about that specifically?
Strategic leaders, as described in Chapter 10, have to think differently. They must operate in terms of multiple timelines, anticipating change years or decades out, and actively shaping the entire organization's culture through long-range directives, policies, and vision.
Okay, which leads us perfectly into our final provocative thought for you to carry forward from this deep dive.
Let's consider Lester's conclusion about Mirza Kabir again. If the tragedy was, in essence, already determined by the failure of political and strategic trust weeks before the battle, if Admiral Gensoul was fundamentally pre-doomed to an impossible ethical choice at the tactical level,
Then what does that imply for leaders today?
given that reality, what is the strategic moral obligation of a leader today? An obligation to ensure that your current actions, or perhaps your failures to act, your failures to communicate effectively, your failures to build trust across boundaries, now do not inadvertently pre-doom your future subordinates to face their own ethically impossible dilemmas down the road.
Wow, so the ethical decisions, the policies you set, the trust you build or destroy right now, it's actually shaping the moral environment and the options available to the leaders who will follow you maybe decades from now.
That's the implication. The moral burden of command isn't just about the crisis you face in the moment, it's also about the long shadow your leadership casts into the future.
Something profound to definitely mull over as you exercise your own stewardship and lead your organization forward. That's it for this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.